Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Aleksandra Bugajski, wildlife biologist with Canadian Wildlife Service and Environment and Climate Change Canada, will be speaking about the Ecological Gifts Program, a legacy for tomorrow, a tax break today. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us for a webinar about prairie swallows by Mercy Harris from the University of Saskatchewan on Thursday, October 12th at 12 p.m. And you can register for this webinar on our website. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, as we have over 100 people registered, you'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions, just type into the Q&A section on the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar, and feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Foraging Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel, and in-kind support has been provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So without further ado, today's presenter is Aleksandra, and she's a biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service and has been the Prairie Regional Coordinator for the Ecological Gifts Program for the past 4 years. She has also previously managed Environment and Climate Change Canada's funding program, the Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk. Prior to joining CWS, Aleksandra worked in the environmental consulting industry, as well as with Parks Canada and conservation nonprofits. She holds a Master's of Science degree from the University of Regina, where she studied the foraging behavior of double-crested cormorants around Lac La Ronge in Saskatchewan. So I'll pass it over to you, Aleksandra.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll start sharing my screen. All right, so hopefully that popped up for you.
It's perfect.
Perfect. All right. All right, thanks for that introduction there, Caitlin. So I'll just add to the introduction there. So I recently changed positions within the Canadian Wildlife Service, so I'm no longer the Ecological Gifts Program Prairie Regional Coordinator. Jamie Calla is actually acting in that position right now, but she is on leave right now, so unfortunately we couldn't tag team this presentation, so but that's okay. So I'll go ahead with this. Sure. There we go. So yeah, the Ecological Gifts Program, or sometimes we refer to as the Eco Gifts Program. And actually, I will turn off my camera here if I can do that. There we go. So the Eco Gifts Program was actually a program that started in 1995 as a way for Canadians with ecologically sensitive land to be able to donate that in the sense that they would like to protect that for the future, donated to basically some eligible recipients that would then conserve that property in perpetuity. So just to kind of give a brief background, sort of pre-eco-gifts, there's an interesting paper out there called "You Can't Give It Away: Tax Aspects of Ecologically Sensitive Lands." So the paper focuses on basically the Income Tax Act and property tax system at that time, and how these tax systems affected the setting aside of ecologically significant lands. Overall, the system at the time gave artificially poor treatment to donations of ecologically sensitive land. So there wasn't a way to foster the public-private partnership that was an objective of the Government of Canada's 1990 Green Plan at the time. So for organizations that, or for the public or for the private sector, there wasn't really that much of an incentive to basically protect this habitat. This paper doesn't necessarily mention the Eco Gifts program, but it was certainly probably a catalyst towards the creation of this in 1995. So again, landowners with ecologically sensitive land, they can donate their property to eligible recipients. Those eligible recipients are charitable organizations such as land trusts or conservation organizations with a mandate to secure land for the purposes of protecting that property for wildlife habitat, for example, or even ecosystem services and whatnot. So government is also an eligible recipient. So we've got municipalities, the provincial government, and even the federal government is able to receive these gifts, and public bodies performing function of government. Although, for any organizations that might want to consider potentially receiving eco gifts, they have to become eligible to receive that, and that basically means that they have to kind of go through an application process with our national secretariat. But we do have a list of eligible recipients currently on our website. So basically this program, again, donors receive significant tax benefits for this. So the expectation then is also that the recipient must protect the property. So before going into the sort of the program process, I figured I'd kind of give an overview of the structure of the program. So on the left there, we've got donors and recipients. They really do kind of the meat of the negotiating and whatnot to make sure that the property is protected. And whereas the regional coordinators there, so we've got 5 regions there, we're not really involved in these sort of negotiations, for example, with a conservation easement or anything else like that. But we do make, small reviews and assessments just to make sure that, again, the property would be eligible for the program and that the property is likely to be protected into the future. So, and then we've got the EGP National Secretariat in Gatineau. So we work with that staff there on sort of more of the high level, like program policy, for example, and guidelines. And then we've got the Independent Appraisal Review Panel. So that is a third-party panel, basically, that reviews the appraisals that we have, that we receive through the program. Essentially, most of the regional coordinators were trained as biologists, so we won't be reviewing these appraisals. We have the experts doing that. So again, this program is it's basically a tax incentive program to kind of encourage private landowners with ecologically sensitive land to donate it. So what are these tax incentives exactly? Well, basically, for most gifts of capital property, the taxable portion is about 50% of the capital gain. So when you purchase a property and over the next 10 years it increases in value, basically the profit that you gain from that is taxable. But in the case of eco gifts, that's actually reduced to 0. So that's like quite a good benefit there. The other benefit with the program is that any unused portion of the donation can be carried forward for 10 years. With regular capital donations, it really is only up to 5 years that you can carry it forward. So again, another benefit that could appeal to certain individuals and corporations. So speaking of individuals and corporations, they receive different types of tax benefits there as well, in that individuals will receive a non-refundable tax credit, whereas corporate donors would receive a deduction from the taxable income. So as a bit of a disclaimer, we always encourage all parties involved to obtain independent legal and financial advice during this process. Again, we're, as the coordinators, kind of there to sort of help you go through the process of the application, but we are not trained to give legal or financial advice. So, that's something we're always kind of encouraging the landowners, the donors themselves, and even the recipient to kind of look into their own situation, because each situation can be quite different and unique. So that is something we always encourage as well. So again, this program being that it provides tax incentives, it's tied to the Income Tax Act. So there are some provisions in there that kind of outline certain information about this, and again, it sort of outlines the what these tax benefits are to landowners who donate land or a partial interest in land to a qualified recipient. It also outlines, that donors are eligible to claim the tax benefit beginning in the tax year in which the gift was made. So I usually what I've sort of experienced is around this time of year, we get a bit of an increase in applications just for people to basically try and get that donation completed for a certain tax year. So under the Income Tax Act, Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC, the minister actually is designated to basically do three things. So we have like three roles, if you want to put it that way, under this program. And that is to certify the ecological sensitivity of the land or partial interest. And we approve the recipient to receive the eco-gift. So even though a recipient might be already eligible to receive eco-gifts, we still approve the recipient for each gift that they receive. We also certify the fair market value of that donation. And again, that just kind of goes through the appraisal review panel, which I'll kind of get into a little bit later. So those are the kind of like the three main things that we sort of certify and approve throughout the process. One other really good aspect of this program is that gifts of land that have already been given, they actually have the donor has up to 3 years to apply to the program. So, if someone had made a donation in 2021, they can actually still apply to the program to potentially receive those benefits. So the Income Tax Act also outlines some of the requirements within the program, so legal, administrative, on the protection. But the main thing too is that, again, there's that expectation that recipients maintain that eco-gift for the long term and conserve it for the long term in perpetuity. And along those lines, there are some restrictions and safeguards put into that Income Tax Act that outlines sort of a tax penalty for some unauthorized changes in use or dispositions of eco-gifts. So I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation, but that's kind of where some of the, again, the provisions kind of come out of that act. All right, so what constitutes a gift? So basically, again, with the Income Tax Act and, Canada Revenue Agency is kind of the authority on that. They have come up with sort of pointers on what sort of defines a gift. So, and again, a donation must fully qualify as a gift under the Canadian tax law. So part of those pointers are that the donor transfers ownership or interest in a property to a qualified recipient. The transfer should be voluntary and no benefit is provided to the donor or person selected by the donor. So when it comes to the no benefit, there is a little bit of a, you can do like split receiving, for example. So a donor can receive some sort of benefit in the form of like a payment, for example. So if they're donating property, a part of that value can actually be paid out, and then the other portion can be donated. And the rule around that, I believe, with the CRA is that a payment can be made up to 80% of the fair market value. So the ETP does not assess whether the donation qualifies as a gift. So that's, again, a bit for the donor and the recipient to kind of make sure that whatever transaction that they're doing does qualify as a gift. And in addition, advance rulings from the CRA are possible, but it is the responsibility of the donor or the recipient. And again, that can be for anything that, if there's any questions about whether this does qualify as a gift or not, you can definitely call that number to gain some information. Certain examples of, potential questions around whether it's a gift or not is when there's an agreement saying that, if you do XYZ, then you should also donate this property. In that case, it doesn't look like it's very voluntary. It's being kind of told that they should donate in order to allow something to happen on that property. So when it comes to land securement, a lot of land trusts and conservation organizations have a lot of tools in their toolbox. So one of them is, purchasing properties, but that can become very hard, with land values being pretty high. So, a lot of the times it's not feasible to purchase a property, and you have to rely on on funding, for example. So there's basically the donation option is another tool in the toolbox for these organizations to kind of use. So the EGP is able to accept donations of fee simple title. So that's where the landowner transfers the land to the recipient. So the recipient becomes the landowner. Then there's also donation of a partial interest or a conservation easement. So a landowner would still, in this case, own the property, but they basically negotiate an agreement with the eligible recipient to basically say that they're not going to develop the property, for example, or subdivide and things like that. And that agreement gets registered on title, and then basically goes with the land for any future landowners to follow. You can also donate a residual interest. So that's kind of, maintaining a life estate. In this case, the recipient would be the landowner, but the initial landowner or the donor can still live the rest of their life on that property. And then you can complete partial donations. So I was earlier speaking to sort of that split receipting with the CRA rule being that up to 80% of the fair market value can be paid out. And so that can be done as well through the program. All right, so looking at so far the gifts that have been completed in Canada and comparing it to the Prairie region, I just looked at our database there yesterday. And so for Canada-wide, we're starting to reach that 2000 mark, so that's great. A lot of gifts have gone through the program since its inception. And yeah, we've actually reached the $1 billion value, but more importantly, we're protecting over 241 hectares through the Eco Gifts program. So that's really great to see. And then with the Prairie region, which includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, we've got 397 Eco Gifts completed to date. And that's protecting over 108 hectares across those prairie provinces. And that's kind of including, different variety types of habitats. We've got native grassland, wetlands, forested, boreal land as well. So yeah, that's kind of it really isn't, a program where we're specifically looking for one specific habitat type. So it's really any sort of landowner with good wildlife habitat can apply. All right, so this slide, it was basically not the most recent, but it is from October of last year, just kind of showing the distribution of eco gifts across Canada. And so you can see that most of the larger eco gifts kind of occurs sort of in the southern portions of BC and Alberta. And that mainly kind of has to do with, the landscape being that there's a lot of large ranches, for example. So those are the kind of gifts that we tend to see in those areas. And then you can see in Ontario, for example, Ontario actually gets the most eco gifts, just given the population out there. for potential donors. But there are smaller gifts, given that it's a lot more, smaller land plots and that sort of cottage countryside kind of landscape out there. So it's just interesting to kind of see that. But we don't see too many right now, Saskatchewan and Manitoba eco gifts. So we're hoping to kind of, push for more applications in those provinces. All right, so I'm just going to kind of jump into, again, going back to those 3 roles that ECCC kind of does through the program process. I'm just kind of going to go through a high-level talk on what the process kind of looks like and what we sort of assess and look at when it comes to applications. So for this part, I mentioned that ECCC, we certify the property as being ecologically sensitive. So we do have national criteria that we follow. Some of the regions actually have their own criteria, for example, Ontario. But for the Prairie region, we just follow the national criteria. And so in those instances, we are looking at both the existing environmental value of the land, but those that may result from conservation initiatives for the future as well. So we also consider that. So I've just kind of listed here the national criteria for ecological sensitivity. So at first glance, when you go to read these, they are quite broad in their definition, but it is meant to be broad given the numerous amount of different types of habitat types that we are dealing with in different situations and landscapes. So we kind of, it's to the advantage to make sure that, no certain habitat isn't included, for example. So, and it sort of allows our region at least to kind of maybe interpret the national criteria based more on a prairie region kind of landscape, for example. So for the first criteria, areas identified or designated or protected by certain systems or bodies. That could be things like, for example, a property might be within the outline of an important bird area, for example. So that's kind of something that we would consider. For number 2, I think this one probably gives, is the hardest to sort of wrap your head around, but we've sort of interpreted it as being sites of wildlife concentration. So, having things like a heron rookery or lots of bat roosts, snake hibernacula, or maybe even just like a wildlife corridor. So those are things that we consider in the assessment. For number 3, these are sites that have, significant current ecological value. So that's kind of fairly straightforward. But we also, again, consider potential for enhanced ecological value. And that's also as a result of their proximity to other significant properties. So if they're next to other protected areas, then that particular property can add as a buffer, for example, to those areas or an additional protected area. Number 4, it's a little bit more straightforward. So municipal or rural lands that are zoned or designated for biodiversity objectives. Number 5 is also fairly straightforward. So we're just kind of looking at whether the property has wetlands on it, or maybe it's, again, like a buffer around a riparian area. And then number 6, we talk about, the maintenance of biodiversity or Canada's environmental heritage. So again, a very broad definition, but we sort of look at, maybe what kind of species of management concern might be on a property, for example. And in terms of Canada's environmental heritage, potentially what other sort of like important Indigenous sites might be on the property as well that could be considered. So those are, the national criteria, again, from like a broad perspective. But when it comes to what information we actually need to kind of assess that criteria, this is sort of just like a quick overview of the type of information we might be looking for. So again, kind of like a proportion of the different habitat types that are on the property, what kind of species of importance that might be on there that either the recipient, maybe when they did their site visit, or even if the landowner has any species that they want to kind of present to us. We also look at what kind of anthropogenic features are on the property as well. So it's almost kind of like a mini baseline, but at a very high level. And of course, maps and aerial photographs of the site are always really good to have for the property. We also do, if it warrants, site visits as well. Because sometimes, it might be hard looking at the imagery of something, whether it might be a bit marginal habitat or not. So doing a bit of a site visit and also kind of meeting with the donor is always kind of good as well, and meeting with the recipient on site. So in those cases, we will take down some information as well. And we always kind of encourage, prior to submitting an application is for the recipients or a potential donor to kind of reach out and ask whether the property would be eligible for the program. That way, that's just to make sure that, you don't go through the process of getting the appraisal done and then you find out, oh, it's actually not eligible for the program. And so we always kind of encourage that initial contact. So in addition to kind of that information that we look for to assess the ecological sensitivity of a property, when it comes to conservation easements, we actually do, again, kind of review the terms of the conservation easement agreement, mainly the restrictions, for example. So that's just to make sure that the easement agreement is going to protect that property in perpetuity. So strong drafting of that conservation easement is critical to ensure that ecological sensitivity is maintained. We're almost kind of starting to run into some situations where a lot of older easements might have weaker wording around things, and new landowners who take over the property who might not be as conservation minded might take advantage of some loopholes in those agreements and whatnot. So that is something that we try to assess, but of course, we don't have a crystal ball, so can't always predict what might happen. But again, something we try to encourage is again the strong wording around the protection. So in some cases, we do have properties that don't qualify. It's very rare, I would say, within the program, mostly because I think that the recipients who are involved in this program really know kind of what we're looking for, but they also have, high standards for what they want to accept as ecologically sensitive gifts. But in general, properties that might not qualify are, properties that might have marginal ecological values, so a little bit degraded. There's a picture of a landfill there, for example. That would be a bit more of an obvious situation where, half of the property is a bit of a landfill. but yeah, those are things that we kind of look at. Small properties, this really kind of depends. If it's a small property that's surrounded by a lot of developed landscape, we're less likely to it's less likely to be eligible, just because of how likely is that property going to be good for wildlife habitat, for example. And but sometimes, again, if it's something that's adjacent to an already larger protected area, for example, then for sure it kind of adds to that area of protected properties already. So again, it depends. Again, unclear or poorly worded CE agreements. So just kind of mentioned that in the last slide. If it offers weak protection of ecological features, it's difficult to enforce, things like that. Also residences, this kind of mainly applies to those fee simple land transfers. So we don't really want to see, like a house on the property. If it can be, moved or taken down, that's kind of what we encourage. subject to high levels of public access. So again, this is kind of on a case-by-case basis. We would like to kind of see, if there's already high levels of public use, but we see that the ecological integrity of the property is still being maintained, then it should still be eligible. In some cases, there might not be any current public access, but the donor or recipient may want to add more public access to it. So adding more trails, for example, more infrastructure. Those are things we would want to know kind of ahead of time to make sure that it is still going to be eligible for the program. But again, if it's based on the context of how big this gift might be, the landscape context, it might not qualify if there's too much going on with the property. Also intended and planned future use. So picture of a roller coaster there, again, very extreme example, but if a donor had wanted to donate their property but still want to put something extravagant like this on their property, we're pretty unlikely to recommend this property for certification. So just to kind of give you an idea of some of the eco gifts that have gone through the program. So this is just in Northwest Alberta. It's a 100 hectare property consisting of aspen, willow, and riparian habitat. And it's adjacent to a federal migratory bird sanctuary, which is also an important bird area. So the property was secured to also add to existing protected areas around that sanctuary and IBA. And I'm just kind of showing the pictures of these just to kind of show that, there's that picture of the sort of oil and gas infrastructure there. And it's just to say that, just because there's some anthropogenic features on a property, it doesn't mean that we're not going to accept it. It doesn't have to be a pristine environment. But again, we do consider maybe the proportion of how much is native, natural vegetation versus anthropogenic or modified lands, but just something that, to show that we do accept gifts with anthropogenic structures, for example. This property is out in Southwest Alberta. So this is 65 hectares. It's about 80% native grassland, with the remaining 20% being cultivated land. So this was provincially identified as an environmentally significant area. So it's an area of Southwest Alberta that has some fragmented grasslands. So it was secured to protect the prairie habitat on the property from being further fragmented, either through agricultural activities or residential development in that area. So, and additionally, it adds to the network of other privately conserved sites around that location. So, so again, this is just to kind of show you that, properties that might not have 100% all natural vegetation, we do accept properties that have some modified portions to it. Here we've got in eastern Saskatchewan, 65 hectares of land in east central part of the province in the Aspen Parkland ecoregion. So the property contains, deciduous stands, native grassland, small wetland complexes, and this property is within, again, an IBA or an important bird area, and it was secured to protect the property from agricultural conversion in the area. All right, so this one's in southern Manitoba. So this one's an interesting one because it's 7 hectares that was donated to the city of Winnipeg. The property is a riparian site and is now a city of Winnipeg park named Pollock Island. So there is a short trail in the park which leads to 3 different displays showing the history of the site, information on the donors, as well as identifying the site as an eco gift. So again, just to kind of clarify that when it comes to public access and use of a property, we will still consider those types of properties, but we definitely look at the context as well, and definitely we encourage recipients to provide draft plans for how they might want to envision the public access happening. How many trails might be going in, the density of the trails and things like that. So those are things that we would assess at the beginning. So this is just to kind of summarize sort of the part one, I would say, of the Eco-Gifts program process. So that's, again, the ecological sensitivity portion. And then part two is the ecological gift certification. So again, when we receive that application and we've deemed the property to be ecologically sensitive, then we have our regional director actually sign off on a certificate. So basically, to clarify, the regional coordinator that receives the application and does the assessment, we can only recommend the property be certified as ecologically sensitive, because in the end, it's the minister or their delegate. Typically within our regions, that would be the regional director. They have the authority to actually certify and accept that. So, when recipients or donors call us and ask whether this would be certified, we really just say that, it does look like it's eligible and we're willing to recommend the property be certified, but we don't hold that decision. And of course, there is an expectation that the recipients who do receive those eco-gifts, that they basically provide a baseline document report within 12 months of the gift being given. All right, so the next portion is certification of the fair market value of a donation. So this is pretty much started when we have received that official application that comes in. So if there's any questions related to an appraisal prior to that, usually we can't really make any designation on those until the application is received. So this is just to kind of, if you're sort of new to these appraisals and fair market values, well, just to kind of provide a definition of fair market value. That's sort of the definition provided by the Appraisal Institute of Canada up there. But essentially, in a nutshell, what it means is that fair market value is the price a product would sell for on the open and unrestricted market between a willing buyer and willing seller, assuming both are reasonably knowledgeable and informed about the asset, are behaving in their own best interests, and are free of undue pressure. So again, it should be a voluntary transaction and no kind of pressure being applied there. So basically, once we receive the appraisal report with the application, and again, the appraisal report can be, this is usually negotiated between the donor and the recipient, who might pay for that service. But essentially, once we receive that appraisal report, as the coordinator, we just kind of have our own little checklist to make sure whatever the content that we need to see is there. But essentially, it's the appraisal review panel that does the actual review of that report. So they work with the EGP National Secretariat based in Gatineau there. And so we always kind of do it so that the information flows through the National Secretariat. So I would send the application to them, and they would pass it on to the appraisal review panel, which is again made up of a lot of different appraisers across the regions, and they basically review that appraisal to make sure that it's sound, it's defensible, and that it makes sense. And they provide basically a recommendation to the minister that basically provides the recommendation of what that fair market value should be. In most cases, the recommendation comes back as the same fair market value as what the application was for. In some rare instances, the panel may come back with a different value, and that sometimes might be a lower value. In rare instances, it might be a higher value. But again, this is just to kind of make sure that that donation value is fair and for what the donation is. A lot of the appraisers, in most cases, they're following the Appraisal Institute of Canada standards, but we also have, with the Eco-Gifts program, the guidelines for appraisals as well. So there's just some minor things that are a little bit different and need to be added to that report that appraisers should be aware of. So once the appraisal review panel kind of comes back with their recommendation, which I'll say that there can be sometimes clarifying memos from them back and forth, but essentially once they've kind of made their recommendation, what the coordinators do is we just send out what's called a notice of determination of fair market value to the donor. And that's just for them to kind of say officially on paper whether they accept that fair market value that was recommended by the panel, request a redetermination if it was different, or withdraw the application from the Eco-Gifts program. And what I have there highlighted is just a note to basically make sure that that recommended value from the panel is actually good for 2 years. So, there's still some time, if things need to be negotiated between the donor and the recipient, there is still time to kind of complete that process. So completing an Eco-Gifts program application. So again, once the donor has kind of signed that notice, and in most cases the donor accepts that determined value. I mentioned that there's still time for donors and recipients to complete their negotiations for the donation. What our next step from our program perspective is that we're looking to receive a copy of the updated land titles, where the land title has either transferred to the recipient or the conservation easement has been registered on title, for example. So in the case of conservation easements, we're looking for a copy of that signed CE agreement as well, just to make sure that whatever the draft conservation easement that was applied for, that's typically within an appraisal report, is still the same. So then once that is received, the final Eco-Gift documents are mailed out. So that's, again, the Certificate of Ecologically Sensitive Land, which is signed by the regional director kind of at the beginning of the process. And then we've got also the statement of the fair market value. So it's a very similar form to that notice, just kind of stating that, that fair market value of the donation. And those are the two forms that you would submit with your tax receipt from the recipient to basically gain those tax benefits. So this slide just kind of summarizes step 2 in the process, what I kind of just spoke about. So again, just kind of the completeness check by the regional coordinator, and then sending off that appraisal report and application package to the National Secretariat. The panel does their review. Then, once they come back with that recommendation, we send the notice to the donor, and then we just basically look for that updated land title and then send out the final documents there. And I should say this process, well, I guess it's on the next slide here, timing of applications. So, there 80% of donations complete the process in typically less than 10 months. But of course, sometimes it might take a little bit longer. If something comes up that the donor may have not thought about and maybe they wanted to add to this agreement or anything like that. So, but to kind of complete the donation within a certain tax year calendar, you want to probably apply around this time of year, so that you can kind of complete the process within that time frame. And again, as mentioned, gifts that have already been made, the donor actually has up to 3 years to apply to the program. So I guess just to kind of mention on the timelines there, the appraisal review panel does have a service standard of 90 days to complete their review. Typically, it doesn't take that long. They're usually pretty good at their turnover rate, but it is something that we always mention to donors and recipients based on timelines. All right, so section 207.31 of the ITA. So this is kind of going back to, I mentioned the safeguards to donations. So when the donation is completed, ECCC, we're not really done with the property. So EGP recipients are responsible for the long-term management and conservation of the ecological gifts and their ecologically sensitive features. So as a safeguard, a federal tax would be imposed on a recipient that conducts an unauthorized change in use or disposition of the gift. And section 207.31 of that Income Tax Act provides that legal framework for this. So it states that the tax, which would be assessed by the Canada Revenue Agency, would be equal to half of the fair market value of the property at the time of the change in use or disposition. So for example, if a change in use of the property occurred in 2021, but it was observed or reported this year, the fair market value of the property would be assessed for 2021. So just to kind of define what we mean by disposition or change in use, basically disposition would be like any change to title that transfers the property in whole or in part, and includes transfer or assignment of an interest or right in the land without ECCC authorization. So examples of that would be, a land trust that eligible recipient transfers an easement to another land trust, and maybe one that might not be eligible. And then a land trust sells a property they own in fee simple to another land trust. An easement is registered on title that was not part of the original gift. So those, would be deemed to have occurred without our authorization, then could be subject to section 207.31. And oops, there we go. So change in use. So this one, we do have a couple of definitions around this as well, and that's kind of mainly around actions resulting in or could result in the diminution of the ecological condition or protection of that gift, or if the recipient fails to take action to enforce the terms of a conservation easement or agreement. There could also be changes to the original terms of the conservation easement and agreement. So maybe the spirit of that conservation easement is changed. So some examples of those would be a land trust transferring an easement to another land trust, or sorry, those are dispositions. Basically, an example would be, a landowner might want to do something that goes against a conservation easement term or restriction. So it's just something that the recipient would have to check in with ECCC to see if it can be authorized or not, and we would do that assessment. So that's kind of the gist of the program on a high level. Of course, each gift is quite unique, so we do assessments on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, if there are any questions, then yeah, I'm available to answer them. Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go. Thanks. Thank you so much for the awesome presentation. It's pretty amazing how conservation has so many different shapes and forms. And yeah, this is really great, the work that you guys are doing here. So we have quite a few questions coming in already. First of all, from Ross, what contact information can be used for the initial contact? You referred to that kind of earlier in the presentation.
Right. So assuming if this is a potential donor, well, so one of the things, like, you can definitely contact, the number that's up there or email. to ask that that you're interested. That is the contact information for our national secretariat, and they can then triage to whichever region it's relevant to. So they can definitely do that step. But also, one of the things that donors need to have in place is that is a recipient that is willing to accept that gift. So, trying to find, again, one of the eligible recipients that we have listed on the website there, finding them and talking to them if they're willing to accept, because it might be, eligible under our program, but the recipient also has the right to accept or deny taking on that gift. And in some instances, it also depends on if it's a conservation easement. Some organizations don't do those. They do simply fee simple, or vice versa. So there's those kinds of steps that a potential donor can take. And again, if it's on the recipient side, if there's some organizations out there that are wanting to think about being an eligible recipient, they would have to go through the application process to become eligible.
So, and so before the application process, the best person to reach out to is the contact information that you have on the slide right now.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we have some questions about recipients. The first question is from Marissa. Are there many Indigenous recipients?
So we don't have many, but we do have one in BC. So that's like a new development, which is awesome to see. So they developed a land trust so that they're able to kind of accept land and whatnot. So yeah, they did their first eco-gift recently. So yeah, it is a work in progress. We'd like to see more of those types of groups, but yeah, right now, there's very few.
That's good to know. The next question is, other than municipalities or like environmental organizations, who are some other types of recipients?
So, so I guess under the public bodies performing a function of government, those can be, in some provinces, you have groups that are like regional park authorities or conservation authorities, they're called. So they're not necessarily government, but they are that they're kind of eligible under that and eligible to receive land as a gift. So that would be another example there.
And which environmental conservation groups would be involved? Like, is Ducks Unlimited or NCC?
Yeah, pretty much. It's the main thing we're looking for is that it has to be a conservation organization where the main mandate is about land securement and habitat protection. And that would be something that, again, National Secretariat kind of reviews during their review for eligibility, but yeah.
Perfect. And are eco gifts confidential, or are the lands included like in a public database or website somewhere, or does that go up to the recipient?
So it is confidential data because it is taxpayer information essentially. So you can't have, Uncle Joe kind of ask like, oh, I have a relative who did an eco gift. I just want to take a look at the paperwork. We don't have that authority. They would have to probably go through CRA for that. But yeah. So.
Thank you. And there's a few questions related to kind of the criteria. So from Marissa again, the value of the properties are currently based on fair market value, but in the future, would there be a way of quantifying and incorporating the value of ecological goods and services to the value of these properties?
Very good question. We have been looking at this and debating it. I've even brought this question up recently at a conference where appraisers were given the presentation and just asked that question, but they didn't have an answer either. And it's really just based on, the system kind of right now it's looked at looking at the highest and best use of a property right now, which is almost counterintuitive to what we're doing. We want to protect this property, but in terms of the fair market value, it's like, how can we best develop this property. So it is something that has been brought up in conversation, but right now I don't think there's anything that we would look at in the near future for that.
Absolutely. PCAP has a week called Prairie's Got the Goods Week, literally all about ecological goods and services and how really, as a society, we don't appreciate or value these
Totally.
goods and services, unfortunately, and it
Yeah.
seems to be everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question on that topic is about grasslands and carbon storage. Um, do you consider the potential for native prairie grasslands to store carbon? Or do you have any information on carbon storage, and is that a criteria you're looking for?
Yeah, no, not directly. It's I mean, it's definitely something we look at like indirectly. I'm just saying like, well, there's a lot of grasslands, so there's that potential for a lot of carbon storage, but we don't have any sort of direct criteria for that.
And then our last question that we have right now is if this will be available on the PCAP YouTube site. And yes, it will. If you go to youtube.com/user/skpcap, you'll be able to find it there in the near future. Probably tomorrow or Friday, I'll get it up there because I'm kind of on the road doing some in-person presentations in Southwest Saskatchewan. But that was one of the reasons we wanted to do this, was to actually have a recording available for people who, want to just get a bit more information before maybe making initial contact. And then people are also welcome to share it to others as well, would be interested. So yeah. Um, we had another question that came in. Claudia says, thank you for the great information. And she's wondering if NCC, CWS, or other federal provincial organizations get to choose their donations, or if it's up to the donor.
No, it's kind of I say it's like a two-way street, and the donor gets to choose who they might want to donate to, but the recipient also has that choice to whether they want to accept that gift or not based on their own, priorities, for example. So it is, I think both get to kind of choose.
Great. We'll just give everyone another minute to type in the last questions that you have here. In the meantime, I just want to remind everyone to check out our PCAP website for barn swallows. Sorry, not barn swallows, prairie swallows, about a webinar coming up on October 12th. And if you're interested in learning more about grasslands and carbon, or ecological goods and services, we have a Prairie's Got the Goods week every year in March. So you can tune into that, or if you go to our YouTube channel, we've had, I think, 5 or 6 versions of it. So on our YouTube channel, you can just type in grassland or carbon storage, and we have lots of resources available there for people that are looking for more specific information on that. So yeah, I think that's it for questions. So we're almost out of time anyways, but I just want to reiterate, we had lots of comments come in to say thank you for the great information and the awesome presentation. So thank you very much, Alex. This was really informative.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us and being able to kind of advertise this program to a lot of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to all of our attendees out there, thank you so much for catching today's webinar. When you leave, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling it out, it really helps us give feedback to our sponsors so we can keep our webinars going into the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.